From Asia News Weekly, this is Asia Now, the podcast featuring stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. Hey everyone, Steve Miller here. The United States announced last week it was planning on sailing its warships into the waters China claims as its sovereign territory. The RAND Corporation's Mark Cozad joins me for this conversation taking place in Asia now. Earlier this week on the Asia Brief, I mentioned that an unnamed senior official told the Financial Times that U.S. warships would sail sometime in the next 2 weeks within the 12 nautical mile radius in the hotly contested Spratly Island chain that China happens to claim as its sovereign territory. China particularly didn't like that, and Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying said, quote, "We will never allow any country to violate China's territorial waters and airspace in the Spratly Islands in the name of protecting freedom of navigation and overflight." End quote. This week I spoke with Mark Cozad, Senior Defense Policy Analyst with the RAND Corporation. I started off our conversation by asking him about the timing of the plan, given Chinese President Xi Jinping's recent U.S. visit.
Well, I think one of the reasons for that was that there was a great deal of concern on the part of the Chinese, and we had talked to several different groups, and it was apparent in Chinese official media that they were concerned about the reception that she was going to get when he came to the United States. And I think in the attempts to try to make this meeting as productive as possible, and hopefully reach some sort of an accommodation or at least an agreement for a way forward, that this was put on the back burner. This is not a new policy discussion. I mean, this has been going on for quite some time, and the issue has definitely been out there. I think one of the reasons for why now is that there wasn't any sense that Xi's visit had accomplished anything in relation to the South China Sea. And I think one of the things that's really puzzling for people is his comment about not militarizing these outposts in the South China Sea, but there's been no follow-up in terms of what militarization means and what the intent behind that statement was. And when asked about it just a couple of days ago, the Foreign Ministry spokesman really didn't have an answer. So I think there's a great deal of skepticism around this situation. I think we've been down this path before. It was roughly the June timeframe when we were told that construction on these outposts was going to stop. And, we have ample evidence that demonstrates that that hasn't been the case. So I think really at this point, the decision has probably come about for a variety of reasons, including political pressure from many in the U.S. who think that the U.S. needs to act in order to maintain its credibility, and this is the most practicable course of action for us.
This exercise would be carried out under the auspices of freedom of navigation, which China says it does support. However, it also says that all of these waters are inherently theirs. It's their sovereign territory, and it doesn't extend freedom of navigation to another country's warships. And we have this 12 nautical mile boundary around its sovereign territory, whether it be overflight with airplanes or through sailing vessels. What kind of response are we likely to see should the United States choose to either fly over or sail within that 12 nautical mile bubble?
I really don't know, and I don't think you have many observers who have a really good idea. I am sure that there's been quite a bit of speculation, but in many of the folks that I talk to, there's not really a good sense of what type of reaction is going to occur. And I think in part, you probably still have a lot of question on the part of Chinese policymakers about what their response will be. This is actually a very interesting situation because really over the course of the past year, most of the situations in the South China Sea have been the United States and partners, allies, others in the region reacting to Chinese actions. And I think what this does is it puts China in the situation where the United States has a well-declared principle, freedom of navigation. I think all parties agree in a very broad general sense in the idea of freedom of navigation. And this is going to be a situation where the Chinese are forced to react. So at this point, I really don't have a good understanding of what that is. And quite frankly, in a lot of respects, this is uncharted territory for us. And there have been very few opportunities where we have really pushed on an issue of principle in this way that could potentially force this type of reaction. And so I think this really does, for both sides, present somewhat of a new situation.
You mentioned how this really wasn't a change in U.S. policy. But if we look at the region, the two countries that have really challenged China to date are the Philippines and Vietnam. And when China moved that oil rig into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone last year, their coast guards, China's and Vietnam's, actually collided. And Vietnam ultimately had to retreat due to excessive damage to their ships. If the United States sails into waters that China feels is its sovereign territory, could we see things escalate to this point? Could we look at essentially a game of chicken between these two nations?
I would be reluctant to say that, and I personally don't think it's going to get to that point. In large part because the United States is not Vietnam, and the United States can bring a great deal more capability to bear in the region. I think China has much greater concerns about what the United States reaction is going to be. And I think one of the messages that came across to a lot of Chinese observers prior to Xi's visit was that there is a sense of political frustration in the United States on a number of levels that really hasn't been there for several years, whether it's the OPM hack, whether it's any number of other cyber intrusions or South China Sea. I mean, there is a general perception in the United States that China is the root of several of these problems. And so there is a new situation. And actually, right before she came, the Pew poll on U.S. views of China came out, and those were definitely on a downward trajectory. So in a situation like this, I would be surprised if China reacted in the same way that it did with the Vietnamese, simply because you have a much larger power than Vietnam, where the trajectory of opinion and the push to some sort of action is much, much greater.
So then what would be an appropriate response for Beijing? I mean, you can't have the United States roll into the South China Sea inside this 12 nautical mile bubble and sit back and do absolutely nothing. What could we see from China?
And again, this is where I think that the Chinese response, any type of response that we see, is probably going to be a long time in coming. I think one of the reasons why the Chinese protests are so vocal at this point is that there is an uncertainty about that position. And if we look at situations like the EP3 incident, it takes a long time for that information and a long time for that decision-making process to actually take root and for a final position to be formulated. So at this point, I think the Chinese are probably in a position of trying to find some response, trying to find some way to react that's going to voice their displeasure but not escalate the situation.
Speaking of escalation, back when China announced the ADIZ over the East China Sea, the United States and several other nations actually carried out overflight operations into the area to challenge China's sovereignty claim. Now, as we look at this sailing operation into the 12 nautical mile bubble, how far does the United States need to traverse that line to drive home their point that they're exercising freedom of navigation?
I don't really know if there is a specific threshold number that you could throw out there. I think as a general principle, if the movement through China's claimed 12 nautical mile zone is one that's shallow and very quick, that probably will send a very bad signal to others in the region and may give China some way of of using that situation to show that they have the upper hand. I think it has to be something that is a very clear statement about U.S. views of freedom of navigation within that 12 nautical miles, and it has to be very clear and not on the outside of whatever that 12 nautical mile zone may be, and not for a short period of time, but something that is a very clear statement that the U.S. is asserting its right to navigate freely in those waters.
If this operation moves forward and the United States is successful, do you think it might inspire, say, the Philippines or possibly Vietnam to carry out their own copycat kind of operations to challenge Beijing's control over those Spratly Islands?
Yes, that's an absolute possibility. But again, that gets back into the whole issue. If the United States really does believe in freedom of navigation, and we don't believe that these structures represent geographical features that should be accorded that 12 nautical miles, then other countries in the region have every right to be able to travel in those areas. And so, yes, I think if you are looking at a situation where you could see escalation, I think it's going to potentially come through a third party who wants to assert that right after the United States does, and you have a Chinese reaction against that third party. And I think that's probably where you're going to see some type of an escalation. But again, Vietnamese and the Philippines have been asserting those rights for some period of time. So I don't necessarily think that would be anything new, but I do think it would be a much bolder step on their part.
If we turn towards the future and take a look at, say, long-term effects, could this have an implication on defense policy in the area?
It may. I mean, one of the things that could actually this could have an impact on China's posture in the South China Sea, and China questioning whether or not it has the capacity to challenge the United States in the South China Sea. And I think in those situations, whenever China has been faced with that type of a challenge, whether it's technology challenge or a broader capability challenge, it may have taken a pause in some of its actions, but it hasn't backed away. It's tried to find other strategies and other ways to fulfill its objectives, and that may take a little bit of time. But then again, China has a great deal of capacity, and China could continue to build up its forces and become more assertive in the South China Sea. I think that would really be the biggest implication. I think for the United States on that, once the United States starts taking these actions, I think it's really essential that it maintain a posture that allows it to assert and reassert this idea of freedom of navigation and support others in the region who do. Otherwise, it's going to be a one-shot attempt that others in the region view as showmanship, if you will, rather than a real attempt to assert these principles.
What about treaty obligations? Should the Philippines or Vietnam try to repeat what the United States did and things escalate, things get a little heated, would the United States be bound by its obligations to step in and lend support?
Vietnam, no, it would not. Philippines, depending on where the incident occurred, the way that the incident occurred, is a potential. I'm not exactly an expert on the U.S.-Philippine bilateral defense treaty, but with the Philippines, there is that possibility. With Vietnam, no. There just isn't the same type of agreement there.
Mark Cozad is a senior defense policy analyst with the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for your time this week.
Oh, no problem. Hopefully that was helpful.
Now, I'd like to hear from you. What are your predictions? Should the U.S. sail close to China's reclaimed islands? This episode of Asia Now features extended content of material originally broadcast as part of the Asian News Weekly podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. Subscribing is free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can subscribe on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. You can also keep up with more news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, please drop us an email message. That address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, remember to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.